So we're on chapter 20 of your world history book, and we're going to be talking about the growth of the British Empire during this time. So in 1900, as you can see, Great Britain was the greatest imperial power in the world. And you can see the area of Canada, onto India, onto Africa, Australia, parts of, here's Papua New Guinea and some of the islands here, and onto, of course, Ireland there. And we're going to go over those areas. So let's begin. British imperialism, 1880 to 1900. Well, this great age of imperialism, England acquired nearly 1 million square miles of territory. And these colonies gave Britain great wealth and great power. That's what imperialism means, is as they were controlling them, they had great wealth and power. But Britain shared her traditions of Christianity and technology and representative government and reform with these countries too. So you can't say it's all bad. As Britain went into these areas, she also brought some good things. And some of the areas, they had all kinds of wars going on and all kinds of things and very primitive governments. And as England came in, that would change in many of those areas. Colonial rules also established law and order and controlled much of the war and bloodshed between various tribes and religious factions in Africa and Asia. Great improvements in the livelihood of the native populations, such as they would get better agriculture, better education, they would have hospitals and industry, technology, those things that Britain provided as they came into these countries. The reasons for expansion, though, Britain, and not only British, but also we have Germany, we have the Dutch, and we have France. They all were grabbing at certain areas because certain areas would provide gold, come in for gold and riches, and onto God and glory. So what does that mean, gold, God, and glory? Well, economic factors, businesses need raw materials to fuel their industries, and some areas would provide great treasures. And they wanted open markets and investment opportunities at this time in these different areas to trade with these areas. And then came the religious factors, as missionaries were at first denied access for fear they would hurt business. So they didn't want the missionaries to come. At first they thought, no, they're not allowed because we don't want them to come because then it would hurt our business. But before long, sincere Christian convictions led them to promote missions, that the 19th century then became the great century of missions. So indeed, the 19th century, I always call it the Church of Philadelphia, in the Bible. It's that great era of the Philadelphia, the church reaching out to the lost world. And so first came the gold. They went in for gold in business, and next for God. And then the patriotic factors grew with the empire. The British were proud of their queen and their flag and their fleet and their empire. So they were actually coming in with the glory of Britain at that time. Also, the British people were curious and fascinated by the stories of these strange peoples and fantastic animals, unusual geography and architecture and exotic clothes and goods that the explorers brought back with them. So going into these areas, they saw, oh, this is very interesting. What else? They were discoverers. So reasons for expansion again, think of God or gold first. They came in for the gold and for the riches, and then for God, for the missions, and then for the glory of England. British diplomacy. So much of the British Empire was acquired through diplomacy. What is diplomacy? It's strategic or negotiation. So basically negotiating things. So a lot of countries go into a certain area and acquire the areas by war. But the British just went in, and through talking to them and diplomacy, they ended up acquiring these lands. Negotiation with native inhabitants rather than the conquest is what they would say. Rather than conquering them, they negotiated with them. As a result, Britain experienced a country of peace from 1815 to 1914. That's a whole century. About after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain, what they call it, Pax Britannica, which means they only had certain occasional disturbances, but most of that whole area was at peace during this century, a whole century. British diplomacy used to check the aggressive acts of other country. So basically what they did, when there be uprisings, they come in to calm them down and to use their diplomacy or negotiations with them. Good idea, don't you think? The Crimean War, 1854 to 1856. So this war happened in as you see, what is now the area of the Ukraine. It's on the Black Sea. So when you hear of the war in Ukraine and stuff, it's kind of like this Crimean War. So this exact area was of Crimea. And so you see the Black Sea and Russia over here in Romania, Bulgaria. They were, actually the British joined France and Sardinia to stop Russia's attempt to assert its dominance over Turkey, a move which endangered the British interests in the Middle East. So Russia was coming over to try to take over this area in Turkey. And both Britain and France were aghast at it. They just like, oh, now Russians refused to back down, and the Allied nations declared war on Russia. A short war here, well, not so short, a couple years, but they were fighting. This centered on the Crimean Peninsula there, located at the northern tip of the Black Sea, right here. Although the Allied forces defeated the Russians, they suffered terrible casualties. England had a lot of casualties during this war. The famous Charge of the Light Brigade by poet Alfred Lord Tennyson characterized this war. If you ever go to read that, it's kind of a prose poetry of what happened during this time. And also it's a time when Florence Nightingale, and we'll talk about her a little bit later, brought attention with attempts to alleviate the suffering of the wounded soldiers during this time. So Florence Nightingale went into this area, and during this area took care of a lot her nurses. They were the first nurses, really, the first nurses that were trained nurses, and they took care of the wounded of England of the Crimean War. And then we have Canada. So if you look on a map, I don't know if this map is that good, but it's a map of 1825. So you see here they called this whole area Rupert's Land, and this was the northwest area. Up here's Alaska and Oregon here, so you can see where Canada is. And Newfoundland, this area, and you can see this area being New Brunswick, this whole area being controlled by England. So after the French and Indian War, which happened 1756 to 1763, and America, we fought that, British superiority was unquestioned. That means British control, not only controlled Canada at that time, but also controlled the United States of America. But the American War of Independence diminished Britain's empire, leaving Canada as England's chief possession in North America. So now that America, down here we see America's down this way and down underneath here, we were free of England, but still Canada was controlled by England. There were still many French settlers in Canada, and they did not get along with the British. In 1791, William Pitt, England's Prime Minister, divided Canada into two sections, the British section and the French section, to ease the tension. So if you look at this area where Quebec is, the French settlements are over in this area here. And most of the rest of the country, of course, was controlled by the English. And they had quite a bit of turmoil for quite a long period of time. even today, a kind of turmoil between the French-speaking Canadians and the English-speaking Canadians. Canada is divided. We saw that they divided Canada in 1830. Canada, again, was in turmoil. You wonder why. We have two cultures. We have the French and the English fighting in Canada. Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, sent Lord Durham right here to investigate. Well, he comes riding in to Canada, to the French-Canadian section on a white horse like he was going to be the savior. And so the French people there really didn't like him. But he came, and his idea was to reunite the two sections into one country and to give Canadians a representative government and to follow a plan for settlement of unoccupied territories. So he was coming in representing England into an area that was both English and French. So this plan, though, was enacted in 1867. It's called the British North American Act. So you can see how long this took. So he comes in 1830, but not until 1867 did anything happen. That's like 37 years. So we see down here to unite the upper and lower, to make French a minority, of course he was English, and to assimilate or Anglize the French majority, to control the French part, and to grant a responsible government. So they were divided, and this not until this plan was enacted in 1867. And this made Canada a self-governing commonwealth. Commonwealth means that basically England was protecting them, but they were under English rule, right? Under the Queen. Canada and England benefited from each other, and England prepared Canada for self-government. So I guess, basically England at that time, they knew what happened in America, and they didn't want to go through another revolutionary war. So they tried to prepare Canada so that Canada would be able to rule itself. So even down here it says, created the roots of today's French separatism. So actually when you go into Canada, there's whole areas that are very French around Quebec and that whole area of Ontario. So Quebec, I should say. So anyway, going on. So let's talk a little bit about India here. India, the East India Company. India was another area that Britain became very concerned with. And let's see, India became a British possession after a struggle with France. So they were struggling in India. In the 1700s, remember India had the Mongol Empire. That big, Taj Mahal and all, when you think of, when you watch the movies about the Arabs back in that time, and you think this was the Mongol Empire, and it was disintegrating, and England and France took advantage of unrest to stake their claims there. So they knew this was the time to come in and we could claim India. The tool of the British settlement was not the English government. Although the English government really wanted to get involved in India, it was a company. And this company was called the East India Company. And they were from England, from Britain. They were British. And they were a powerful trading company, but they were not officially connected with the government. Well, the East India Company fought France to protect its territories in 1750s. And so France was actually pulling out of India. And this is about the same time France was fighting America at the French and Indian War too. So they were fighting France over the centuries, we know that. But the British government aided the company, but did not involve itself directly in the conflict. So basically the company, the East India Company, was fighting off the French and some of the Indian soldiers back that time, we'll find out, at the same time. So it was the company that had to fight so they could keep trade there in India. In 1757, Robert Clive won in the Battle of Plassey against the Indian forces. So you have the Indian forces are uprising now. They really don't want this company in, and the company controlling, bringing out a lot of the natural resources, and as the company controlled nearly all of India. And then in 1760, England was the only European power left in India as France decided to withdraw from India. You can see here the East India Company, and even the coins said East India Company, a very wealthy company. The Sepoy Rebellion. So this was a rebellion where the Indians, those from India, we're not talking about the Indians in America, remember, from India. So various factions of India, various factions caused a problem for the East India Company. So now we have fighting again with the East India Company and the natives there, which were basically called Indians. The British government acknowledged that the company was not capable of controlling India. So what happened during the Sepoy Rebellion? You're having this rebellion, and it was going on far too long and endangering a lot of English people in India. So the Acts of Parliament in 1818, 1833, and 1853, the British reduced the power of the East India Company and assumed control. So they said, we have to come in and no more East India Company, we will control India. British did not want to take over India at that time, but they decided they had to. But the British did not completely control this area until this rebellion happened. And because this rebellion, the Sepoy Rebellion happened, it precipitated drastic action. This rebellion got so bad that England had to come in to protect the English there. You can see here, these are the mutiny. They call it a mutiny, basically, because the Indian people are uprising against the British people there. The Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, remember that date, 1857, began among the native soldiers in the British Army and involved age-old religious traditions because they believed the British soldiers had no respect for their religious beliefs. And so the native troops rebelled against the British troops. And this revolt spread beyond the military, and many civilians shared the fears that the British influences would weaken and destroy India's tradition and political autonomy. So the British quelled the rebellion. So the British came in because the rebellion, here's just a symbol. Of course, we don't have a huge lion like that, but that was a symbol of India coming to fight Britain. And then you see the fighting here. Especially this top picture here is kind of because you see this woman, because the civilians, the people that were living there, that had settled there, had to protect themselves because they were going to be killed by the native people there, the Indians. And so that's when the British came in and stopped this rebellion. The India Act in 1858. Well, Parliament passed the India Act, which took away the last authority of the East India Company and gave full control of India to the British government. So that's what happened. Parliament came in. Here's him coming into India, and the Queen's there. So the Parliament now recognized the Queen Victoria now as Empress of India. So Britain totally takes over India because they felt like they had to at this point, because of all of the uprisings and all of the chaos there. But during this time, we have missionaries. We have missions going on in India. And the famous William Carey, he's one of the greatest missionaries to India. You can see here, he was a shoemaker. He was a shoemaker, and he saw going to India. He wanted to go and be a missionary there, and he ended up with so many people coming to the Lord. William Carey lived 1761 to 1834, and he was responsible for the translation of the Bible into over 40 Indian languages and dialects. So he worked hard to translate the Bible. He also wrote grammar books for eight of these tongues and encouraged Indian education. So he also was translating these books and grammar books so that he could educate the Indians. He helped improve agriculture methods too. I didn't know that, but he helped them with their agriculture. And then what you know about William Carey, I think this is such an amazing thing, is he did get politically involved because he discouraged, there was a Hindu practice, and they would sacrifice their babies to idols. And then there was another practice called suti. And suti, they forced the widows to hurl themselves into the fire at their husband's funerals. So when a woman, if your husband died, you would be sacrificed. When they burned the husband's body as cremation, burn them, you would be thrown in the fire with your husband. So you better not have a husband that's going to die, because you would die with him. And so Carey, he had to settle this all. So he went to the government and said how horrible this was for these women, and it became against the law to sacrifice your babies to idols and to do this suti, sacrifice these widows in the funerals. So 2 great things that William Carey did in India. Carey had to settle in the Danish territory because the hostility toward the East India Company toward the missions, because a lot of the Indian people in India, they did not like the East India Company, and also the East Indian Company didn't like missionaries. So the missionaries, you had to basically sneak in, and you had to be very careful and not represent the East India Company, and show them that you were bringing the gospel in there, which would be a hard deal. And then the East Indian Company didn't like you either, so you would be under a lot of dangerous ground there. But gradually, missionaries were able to be settled in India and to share the gospel. Other missionaries to India, we have Henry Martyn and Alexander Duff. You know, they were famous, but also Amy Carmichael. I love to read Amy Carmichael's biographies or autobiographies of her life. And anyway, Amy Carmichael lived 1868 to 1951, and she was from the country of Ireland. And Amy worked hard to rescue young Indian girls from a life of prostitution in the pagan temples and to bring them to Christ. You see, when you think of imperialism, you don't think of these things as these missionaries coming in and rescuing so many people and changing the lifestyle from a lifestyle of Hinduism, which was so detrimental to so many lives, and the freedom of being a Christian in Christ. And so Amy, just a girl at that time, went in and worked hard and led many to Jesus. The blending of the East and West. So I'm going to stop here and we'll continue in the next video.